On a grey Sunday afternoon in early March, my son told me, as casually as if he were reading off a weather report, "You don't need to call any more. I'll reach out if something comes up." He stood just outside his car, not bothering to. Closed the door, his eyes darting to his watch, then to the grocery bags in the trunk. I remember the wind lifting my scarf slightly, the birds loud in the bare branches behind me, as though nature hadn't caught up with the silence he'd just created. I'm Ellen Royston. I'm 71 years old, and that was the moment I knew my place in his world had changed, or maybe it had been fading for years, and I had just refused to see it until that sentence made it real. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. He didn't hug me goodbye. He didn't say, "Love you, Mom." He barely looked me in the eyes, and I stood there on the curb, still holding the folded grocery list I had written for myself, the one with neat little bullet points for things I'd planned to cook for him and the grandkids if they stopped by during the week. They never did. The silence of that ride home clung to me like fog. I didn't even turn on the radio. I just let the hum of the road fill my ears while my mind wandered through memories, some warm, others sharp. The steering wheel felt cold in my hands, my little cottage, which once buzzed with Sunday dinners and toy-strewn floors, now felt like a museum of what once was. That day, I didn't make it past the hallway. I just stood there staring at the photo of him at 12, front teeth missing, arms flung around his dog, and wondered how far we'd really drifted. I suppose people always think there's more time. More time to repair things, more time for them to come around, but when your own child tells you to stop reaching out, there's a finality in that. It is the closing of a gate you didn't even realize you were standing behind. And when it clicks shut, there is no sound in the world that feels quite as lonely. I had seen the signs before, of course, the postponed birthdays, the Christmas invitations that never arrived, the texts that went unanswered for days, but there is something different about hearing it spoken out loud, something brutally freeing. In a way, he had said it, I no longer had to guess. When I got inside, I put away the few things I had picked up for the week: soup tins, fresh spinach, a small box of Earl Grey tea. The house was still, as it always was. I stood at the kitchen counter and brewed a cup, letting the kettle whistle longer than it needed to. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I simply sat down in my favorite chair, opened my journal, and wrote. He said I don't need to call any more. So I won't. I don't think sons realize the weight their words carry. The way a single sentence can echo down the halls of a mother's memory. He had once run into my arms when he scraped his knee. He had once whispered, "Don't leave me," when I tucked him in after nightmares. I had once sung to him softly while brushing his hair back after fevers. And now, in the same life, he was telling me not to call. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, listening to the soft ticking of the old wall clock, the one my husband had gifted me on our 15th anniversary. He used to call it our heartbeat clock because its steady rhythm always seemed to bring calm. That night, it felt like a countdown. I thought of what it meant to be a mother. How much of our lives we spend holding things, holding little hands, holding secrets, holding back tears, holding together families even when they fray at the edges. And now I was being told to let go, not asked, told. There's no handbook for how to survive being quietly dismissed. It's not loud. It's not a dramatic explosion. It's a soft erosion. Like watching your name fade on an envelope that used to arrive weekly in the mail, like finding your birthday card 3 days late, unsigned, or realizing that no one asks if you've eaten, though you spent decades asking them. I sat with those thoughts until morning, when the sun finally lifted, casting pale gold across my wooden floors. I made my way to the front garden. The roses had just started to peek through again, Early, hesitant, like they weren't sure if they were welcome yet, I knelt down and pruned them gently, talking to them in my head the way I used to talk to my children, telling them I was glad to see them again, that I hadn't forgotten, and I knew, somewhere deep in that silence, that something in me had changed. That morning, I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't check my messages. I didn't wonder if maybe he hadn't meant it. I simply moved through the day with a kind of slow, aching grace. Sometimes, when people let you go, they don't realize they've also given you permission to stop waiting. And maybe, just maybe, that's when something else begins. I wasn't born knowing how to be a mother. No one is, I suppose. But I learned the way a flame learns to burn, slowly, over time, with warmth and with pain. I married young, as many of us did back then. I was 23, fresh out of nursing school, and thought I knew everything about love. His name was Robert. He had wide shoulders and a quiet, careful way about him. He didn't speak often, but when he did, I listened like it was scripture. Our first apartment had more cockroaches than light switches, but we made it home. I stitched curtains out of old tablecloths. He built shelves from leftover wood scraps. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and for a while, that felt like enough. Then came David. He arrived on a cold night in February. I remember the sharp scent of antiseptic in the hospital room and how the nurse placed his tiny body against my chest. I'd never felt that kind of love before. Fierce, instinctive, terrifying. That night, as snow gathered on the windowsill, I whispered promises into the crown of his head, that I would never leave him, that he would always be safe with me. From that moment on, my life wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to David. To scrape knees and night terrors, to peanut butter sandwiches cut diagonally, not straight, to midnight fevers and school fundraisers, and shoelaces that always came undone. I worked night shifts at the hospital, sleeping in broken hours during the day, just to be there for him after school. I learned how to fold laundry one-handed while rocking him with the other. I knew the names of all his teachers, his friends, his imaginary dog, even though we had a very real one who chewed the sofa legs to dust. When he turned 7, I saved for 6 months to buy him the Lego pirate ship he'd circled in the toy catalogue. The joy on his face that Christmas morning still lives in the folds of my memory like a pressed flower, faded but sacred. And when he lost his first tooth, I stayed up until dawn sewing a little pillow shaped like a tooth, just so he'd have somewhere special to hide it. Robert passed away when David was 12. A heart attack, sudden and silent. I remember the way his coffee cup was still warm when the paramedics carried him out. After that, it was just the two of us. I went back to full-time shifts. I packed his lunches in the dark and left little notes inside, even if I was too tired to spell everything right. I kept our home going, thread by thread. I didn't cry in front of him. I let the grief run its course only when the house was silent and he was asleep. I drove him to every soccer practice, every science fair. I sat through concerts where he barely tapped the triangle and applauded like he was Mozart. I helped him fill out college applications late into the night, eyes burning, hands aching from a long shift. He got into a good school, not Ivy League, but solid. I co-signed the loan. I dipped into the savings Robert and I had stashed away for a trip we never took. I smiled when he left, even though it felt like my lungs were folding inward. And even then, I never asked for much. A call every now and then, a visit on my birthday, a picture of the grandkids when they came. I baked his favourite peach cobbler when he brought them the first few times. I kept toys in the cupboard just in case they stayed the night. I even replaced the old couch because the springs had gotten too loud, and I didn't want the baby to wake, but the visits dwindled. At first, it was work. Then the kids had soccer. Then it was just too far, too. Drive, I understood, or told myself I did. I always left the porch light on. Just in case, I kept the pantry full. The cobbler dish stayed clean and unused, but I waited anyway. I helped with their down payment when they bought their first house, quietly, without being asked. I sent a check. I remember the way David said thank you, over the phone, hurried like it was a bill being paid, not a gesture of love. I didn't mind. I was proud of him, proud of who he had become, proud of what I had helped him become. When his wife was on bed rest with their second child, I came over every morning for 3 weeks, cooked oatmeal, folded laundry, and kept the older one occupied. I never sat down. I never asked for gas money. When I left, she said, "Thanks, Ellen," not Mom, not "thank you for everything." Just my name, like I was a housekeeper. Still, I didn't take offense. I told myself love doesn't always wear the clothes you expect. Sometimes it comes in awkward silences or late-night voicemails. I thought if I gave enough, eventually it would return to me. But love isn't always a boomerang. Sometimes it's a letter dropped in the wind. Over the years, I gave more than I ever had, not in dollars, but in devotion. In some ways only a mother measures, sitting by the hospital bed when he had surgery on his knee. Driving through storms to be there when the pipes burst in their basement, watching their dog for weeks while they vacationed in Spain. They brought me back a mug, not even the good kind. One of those flimsy souvenir ones with the city name peeling off. I was never the loud type. Never kept score. I believed that when you love someone, truly love them, you don't count what you give. You just give. I did that for decades, but now, looking back, I wonder, was it love that made me so quiet? Or fear? Fear that if I asked for more, they'd give even less. There's a difference between giving freely and giving yourself away. I didn't know that then, but I know it now, and still. I would have done it all again, every note, every ride, every midnight shift, because that's what you do for the people you raise. You pour yourself out, thinking they'll remember the shape of your love, but memory fades, and sometimes. So does gratitude. The things I did for them are not written anywhere but in my own bones, in the curve of my spine, in the ache of my knees, in the soft, empty echo of a phone that no longer rings. And maybe that's why it hurt so much when he told me to stop calling, because for over 40 years, my whole life had been a call to him, and now the line was dead. People always ask, when they hear stories like mine, didn't you see it coming? And the truth is, yes, but not all at once. It doesn't hit like a lightning bolt. It creeps in like ivy, slow and quiet, one vine at a time, until, one day, you can't find the front door anymore. The 100 quiet hurts didn't begin with him telling me not to call. That was just the last stone in the river. The others had been dropping for years. I remember the first time he forgot my birthday. I was 65. I had baked myself a little lemon cake the night before, thinking I'd save him the trouble. I even wrapped my own gift, a new pair of garden gloves I'd picked out at the hardware store. Practical, soft inside, with tiny blue stitching at the wrists. I made a pot of tea and waited until evening, thinking maybe he was just running late. When the day passed and the phone stayed silent, I told myself he was busy. Work, children, life. The next day, he sent a text. Just the word, "Sorry, Mom, crazy day yesterday." That was all. No call, no card, no cake. I still wore the gloves. I still kept the wrapping in the drawer under the sink. The visits started to thin out next. At first it was once a week, then every other. Eventually, I'd go months without hearing his voice. He never asked if I needed anything, if I was lonely. I don't think he ever knew about the time I slipped on the back steps and twisted my ankle. I kept the bruise to myself, wrapped it in ice, and told the neighbor who saw me limping that I'd stepped wrong in the garden when I got the flu one winter. Fever, chills, the kind of sickness that Makes you talk to God in the dark. I didn't even bother calling him. He had told me not to fuss, not to be dramatic. He once said I made things heavier than they needed to be. So I lay there alone for 3 days, sipping broth and talking to the walls. It wasn't one big betrayal that broke me. It was the accumulation of silence, the steady erosion of attention. He started making jokes in front of others, little barbs wrapped in humor. At a family barbecue, he laughed and said, "Mom's a bit behind on the times, she still writes checks." Everyone chuckled. I smiled too, even though I just paid for their daughter's ballet recital with one of those checks. There was the time his wife told me not to bring dessert anymore, said they were trying to cut sugar. But then I saw the bakery box on the counter when I stopped by unannounced to return a book. Store-bought, probably easier, no expectations, no stories in the crust. I was still invited to holidays. At least on paper, but I started to notice that my chair was always near the edge of the table, not beside him like before. Conversations moved around me, not with me. When I offered to help, I was told to just relax, but when I sat quietly, I felt like an afterthought, like wallpaper. The grandchildren stopped hugging me after a while. At first, I thought they were just growing up, but then I saw how they curled into the arms of their other grandmother, the one who lived nearby. The one they called Nana. I was Grandma Ellen, said like a formality, like a substitute teacher's name. I had always imagined that age brought dignity, that growing older would earn me a certain reverence, but instead I felt smaller. Like the older I got, the more invisible I became. No one asked about my stories anymore, about how Robert and I met, about the old house on River Street where the walls bled light in the morning, about how I used to knit baby booties for the NICU on my nights off. That part of me had no audience now. Even my belongings began to feel like relics no one would want. I caught his wife glancing at my china cabinet once, her eyes scanning it like a catalogue, as if mentally dividing what would go where when I was gone. I noticed the way she said, "When you downsize, not if." David once brought up power of attorney over coffee, said it casually, like discussing a change in the weather. Said he just wanted to have things in order, in case anything happened. He used that phrase, "in case anything happens," like I was already halfway gone. I told him I'd think about it. I never did. Every time I offered myself time, energy, love, it felt more like a transaction than a connection, as though my usefulness was all I had left to offer, and once that was gone, I feared I would vanish entirely. I started noticing small things, that the porch light stayed off when I pulled into their driveway, that no one ever sent leftovers home with me, that the photo of Robert, the one where he's holding baby David in a plaid shirt, grinning wide, had disappeared from their mantle, replaced with something neutral, something newer. It's hard to describe how it feels to be slowly removed from your own story. You start to wonder if maybe you loved too hard, if maybe you should have asked for more, or if it was always like this and you just didn't want to see it. I kept my silence. I kept showing up. I kept baking the cobbler, just in case, but inside, something was shifting. You can only be forgotten so many times before you start remembering yourself instead. These weren't loud betrayals. They didn't come with slammed doors or shouted words. They were quiet, subtle, like standing next to someone who slowly turns their body away, like hearing your name less and less. And so I carried those 100 quiet hurts the way old women carry cardigans, softly, over their shoulders, even when it's warm, just in case, because when the people you love stop seeing you, you start learning how to see yourself, not as a mother or a wife or a helper, but as someone still here, still breathing, still waiting, perhaps, for one more reason to be known. I had always told myself that love was enough, that if I just kept giving, kept showing up, kept being useful, they would come back round. Maybe they were busy, maybe they were tired, maybe I just had to wait, but something shifted the summer I turned 70. It was July, sticky and airless. The kind of heat that clings to your skin even after the sun goes down. I remember it because the hydrangeas had all wilted early, and I spent an entire morning pruning them back, feeling like I was cutting away something more than just stems, that same afternoon. I received a letter in the mail from the county office. Thin envelope, pale blue ink, and an unfamiliar return address. I assumed it was a notice about taxes or neighborhood updates, but when I opened it and scanned the words, my heart stilled. It was confirmation of a property deed transfer. The house, my house, had been transferred into David's name. Signed, notarized, filed, effective immediately. I read it twice before I realized I was holding my breath. Then a third time, searching for some explanation that would make it less absurd, but it was all there, in neat legal language. Ellen Royston, former sole owner, now listed as occupant. No mention of a sale, no purchase, no exchange of money. Just changed. As if I were a tenant in my own life, I felt a buzzing in my ears as I sank into the kitchen chair. The ticking clock on the wall grew loud again, louder than I remembered. The same clock Robert had hung up in the corner 30 years ago. Now watching me as I tried to make sense of what had just happened, I shuffled to the drawer where I kept old files, bank papers, the original deed, my will, all of it neatly clipped and labelled. Like the nurse I once was, I flipped through every folder, trembling fingers grazing each page. And there it was, tucked behind the insurance papers. A copy of a document I didn't recall signing. My name, my signature, my house, transferred. I sat there for hours, not crying, not moving, just unraveling. I remembered a day a few months earlier when David had dropped by unexpectedly. He'd brought me a cup of coffee from my favorite little corner shop, the one I'd introduced him to when he was a teenager. We sat on the porch, and he said he had some paperwork for me to sign. Said it was just standard stuff, to make sure everything was in order for emergencies. I hadn't read it. I trusted him. I remember thinking how rare it was for him to come by like that. How grateful I felt just to share a coffee and the soft buzz of bees in the garden. I remember being so relieved by his warmth that day, so hungry for connection, that I would have signed anything to keep it, and I did. He didn't steal the house, he asked. He just didn't tell me what he was really asking for. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my armchair with the deed in one hand and the untouched cup of chamomile tea in the other, watching the moon move across the floorboards. At some point, the tea went cold, and the bitterness bloomed on my tongue like metal. I didn't call him. What would I say? That I had trusted him, that I had raised him to be better, that he had quietly made me a guest in the place I'd built with my own hands. It wouldn't matter. He would talk in circles. He would say I'd misunderstood. He would remind me I had signed it. He would say, "It's still your house, Mom," even though it no longer was. It wasn't about the bricks or the mortgage. It was about the breach, the quiet betrayal, the assumption that I wouldn't notice or that I wouldn't care. That I was already old enough to begin handing things over, even if I wasn't ready, even if I wasn't asked. The next morning, I put on my best cardigan, the grey one with pearl buttons, and went down to the county office. I waited in a line that smelled of stale air conditioning and floor wax. The clerk behind the glass was kind. She checked the documents, confirmed everything was legal, and told me softly, almost with sympathy, it was notarized. There's not much we can do without proof of coercion. Coercion. Such a heavy word for something done with a smile. And a cup of coffee. On the way home, I drove slowly, almost absently. I passed the church where Robert and I used to go every Christmas Eve. I passed the park where David once broke his arm trying to climb the monkey bars to fast. And I passed the little lawyer's office at the corner of Maple and Third. A name I hadn't thought of in years. I turned around. He was still there, same name on the door. He was older now, like me. He remembered Robert. Remembering the time we'd come in together to update our wills. When I told him what had happened, he didn't flinch, just nodded, took out a yellow legal pad, and started writing. I'm not interested in fighting, I told him. He looked at me and said, then let's make sure you're protected going forward. We spent the next hour going through every document, every account, every forgotten file. When I walked out, I wasn't angry. I was something else entirely. I was done. I went home and sat at the dining table that night, staring at the empty second chair. I lit a candle, not for mourning, but for clarity, and then I opened my notebook. The same one where I used to write grocery lists and family birthdays. This time I made a different list. I wrote down everything I still owned, everything that had not yet been touched, my grandmother's jewelry, the modest savings account, the collection of vintage cookbooks, the heirloom dishes passed down from my mother's mother. I thought about who had asked about them over the years and who hadn't. Then, on the last page, I wrote for words, bold and unshaking. I still have power, not loud, not revenge, just the power to choose, the power to protect what remained. The final line had been crossed, the house was gone, at least on paper. But I was still here, and I wasn't finished yet. I didn't tell anyone what I had found out. Not David, not his wife. Not the neighbour who still brought me tomatoes when her garden overflowed in August. Instead, I folded myself into silence, not the cold kind that punishes, but the deep kind that listens. Listening to the wind, to the walls, to the sound of my own breath at night when the world is quiet and the ache is loudest. In the beginning, I kept imagining how he would explain it if I brought it up. I knew his voice, his cadence, soft, reasonable, always just firm enough to sound right even when he wasn't. He would say, "Mum, I was just trying to prepare things so you wouldn't have to worry." Or, "You said you didn't want to deal with paperwork anymore," and maybe I had said something like that in passing, during a tired afternoon over lukewarm tea. But it wasn't permission, it wasn't consent. Still, I didn't call. I didn't confront, I simply stopped. I stopped sending birthday cards for the kids, stopped making peach cobbler just in case, stopped checking my phone every evening around 7, hoping his name would appear. There is a certain dignity in retreat, I've learned, a kind of strength in choosing quiet over conflict. I didn't want to fight my son. I didn't want to unravel us with words that couldn't be taken back. I just needed to step out of the space where I was no longer welcome. I spent my days differently after that. Mornings in the garden became longer. I would kneel by the petunias and talk to them in my head, as I used to do when David was away at college and the loneliness pressed too close. I started journaling again, not out of habit, but out of necessity. There were feelings inside me that had no room anywhere else. Anger, yes, but also grief. A kind of mourning for a child who was still alive but no longer saw me. I didn't write to blame him. I wrote to understand myself, in one entry. I wrote, I think I kept giving because I believed love would circle back, but maybe love, like light, bends when it passes through some people, and I started saving. Not out of spite, not to hoard or hide, but because suddenly every dollar felt like a stitch in a new garment I was sewing, one meant only for me. I cancelled the magazine subscriptions I kept for guests, closed the credit card he once used for emergencies, quiet things, little things, but they added up, slowly. I began to feel less like an open hand and more like a whole person. I also went through my will. I pulled it from the fireproof box in my bedroom closet, the one Robert and I used to joke was our doomsday drawer. I read every line, every clause. There it was, plain and untouched for nearly 20 years. David listed as sole heir. My signature at the bottom looked young, naive, even. I ran my fingers over the ink like it might come undone, and then I called Mr. Green, the lawyer, the same man who'd once drafted that very document when Robert was still alive and we were both still foolish enough to believe in permanence. He met me in his office that Friday, wore the same checkered tie he'd had on the day I told him about the house transfer. We sat across from one another, a small vase of wilting carnations between us. He didn't ask many questions, just slid the fresh pages toward me and said, "Whenever you're ready, this time." I read every word. I removed David's name, not as revenge, as reality. He no longer saw me as someone to protect. He saw me as a stepping stone, a burden to be moved around, a dot on the timeline of his eventual freedom. So I changed the beneficiary to someone else, a women's literacy fund I had quietly donated to over the years, an organization that taught older women how to read, how to find their voice again. It felt right. I left a few personal things. Aside for distant cousins, an old friend from nursing school, the church down the road, nothing grand, just the pieces of my life that still felt like they had meaning. The rest, the money, the jewelry, the antique desk Robert had refinished with his own hands, would go to those who valued stories, who understood the quiet work of holding things together. After signing, I sat in my car for a long while, watching the trees sway against the glass. I wasn't happy, but I wasn't broken, either. I was in the in-between, where truth settles in your bones and lives there without asking for approval. Back at home, I didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't need to. I had always been loud in my giving. Now I was learning how to be silent in my keeping. Even the house felt different, as though it understood it was no longer truly mine, but still held me like an old friend. I dusted the mantel with care, rearranged the photos, removed the ones where I no longer recognized the smile, mine or his. I started writing letters, not to send, just to write, one for Robert, thanking him for always letting me lead when I needed to, one for David, folded neatly into an envelope I tucked beneath my pillow. I didn't sign it, just wrote, "You don't get to decide when I disappear." I didn't cook elaborate meals anymore. My dinners became simple, roasted vegetables, buttered toast, the occasional glass of white wine. I read more, walk longer, stared out the window at dusk and let the sky remind me that endings can still be soft. People often think silence means defeat, but that isn't true. Silence is a strategy, a protection, a kind of rebirth. It's the sound of no longer trying to be what someone else doesn't even see in my silence. I became real to myself again. I wasn't David's mother, who baked and paid and waited. I was Ellen Royston, a woman with her own thoughts, her own limits, her own quiet line no one else could cross. And I never called him again. It wasn't a grand transformation. There was no haircut, no sudden trip to Italy, no dramatic burning of photographs. I simply started moving through the world a little differently at first. It was so subtle that even I didn't recognize it. But then I began to notice how the quiet inside me was no longer just absence. It was space to decide, to choose, to breathe without bracing for disappointment. I started with the mornings. I used to wake early out of habit, coffee on by 6, news on low volume, checking my phone before the sun had fully risen, hoping for a message. Now I left the phone on the nightstand. I brewed my coffee slowly, watching the steam rise like a soft ghost from the mug. I would carry it to the back porch and sit, just sit, without expectation. I listened to the birds again, noticed how the doves always came before the crows, how the old oak in the yard dropped its leaves with a kind of dignity, even when no one was watching. The silence that once hurt now held me. I stopped doing things out of duty. No more attending birthday parties I wasn't truly invited to, only tolerated at. No more offering to drive across town when the carpool failed. No more baking for holidays. I wasn't asked to be part of. I donated the children's toys I had kept in the hallway cupboard. Every block, every stuffed bear, every puzzle piece that once waited for a tiny hand that never returned, I folded them into clean boxes and took them to the shelter near the train station. The woman who took them smiled. "These will go." "Fast," she said. I smiled back. "They've waited long enough." I started writing again, not just letters tucked into drawers, but real writing, pages and pages in the quiet hours of afternoon. I bought a fresh set of pens, the good kind, the ones that don't stutter when you press down. I found a sturdy leather journal and titled the first page, "Things I Remember That Still Matter." One page became 10, then 50, some memories. Were soft, Robert laughing in the kitchen, while I danced with flour on my cheeks, David falling asleep on my chest with his favourite book half open in his lap. The lilacs blooming too early the year my mother passed, others were harder. Like the Christmas I spent alone, pretending to have plans when the silence wrapped around me like a second skin, or the day I found out my name had been quietly removed from the house. As if I were an error being corrected, but I wrote them, all, because they were mine, and I no longer needed someone else to remember them in order for them to be real, a few weeks after finalizing the new will. I received a call from the foundation I had named as beneficiary. The woman on the line had a warm, unhurried voice. She said, "We're honored, Ms. Royston. Would you like to be involved with any of the local programs?" I surprised myself by saying yes. That following Tuesday, I visited the community center tucked behind the old post office. It was nothing fancy, beige walls, chipped linoleum, folding chairs that cracked, but it pulsed with life. Women, in their 50s, 60s, even 80s, were gathered in circles, learning to read, to write, to tell their stories. One woman, Olma, was 74 and just beginning to read aloud for the first time. She stumbled through the words, then laughed with her whole chest when she finished the paragraph. That laughter stitched something back inside me. By the end of the afternoon, I'd signed up to volunteer once a week, not as a donor, but as a companion, a listener, a woman who had been quiet for too long and had found her voice not in shouting, but in being heard. I changed other things. Too, I sold the jewelry Robert's aunt had left me, pieces I never wore, never cared for. With the money, I had a small greenhouse built in the backyard. Nothing extravagant. Just glass and wood and possibility. I filled it with herbs, tomatoes, and lavender. The smell reminded me of summers gone, of healing. The antique desk, Robert's masterpiece, I had restored professionally. I moved it to the front room, where sunlight falls across it just right in the morning. I sit there now with my tea, writing, thinking, breathing. One afternoon, I opened a drawer and found a photograph of David from when he was 7, all toothy grin and scraped elbows. A paper crown on his head from the birthday party I stayed up all night to plan. I ran my thumb over the edge of the photo and whispered, "I loved you then, I love you still, but I don't have to lose myself to prove it." I tucked the photo into a new folder. I labeled it before. I never stopped loving him. But I did stop letting that love erase me. I no longer dreamed of reconciliation. That fantasy had dissolved into the soil beneath my greenhouse, fed the roots of something more nourishing, peace, purpose, a sense of self untethered from anyone else's needs. A neighbor, a kind woman named Lucille, noticed the changes. She knocked on my door one afternoon with a peach pie and said, "You've been blowing lately. Did something good happen?" I smiled. Yes, it happened. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Not my worth, not my usefulness, not my love. I moved differently now, not to be seen, not to be chosen, but to be whole. And in that shift, something inside me settled, like a house finally returned to its true foundation. I had not disappeared, but in the space where I used to orbit them. Bending time and energy to their needs, there was now absence. A shape once filled with care and presence, suddenly vacant. It didn't happen overnight. No one called in a panic. No one showed up at my door asking why I hadn't sent the usual birthday check or offered to babysit over a holiday weekend. In the beginning, I imagined they didn't even notice. The convenience of my love had made it easy to overlook. But absence has weight. It presses, and eventually, by autumn, subtle tremors began to surface. I received a voicemail from David in late September. I listened to it once, then again. His voice was pleasant, almost chipper, but polished, like someone trying to step onto a stage they hadn't rehearsed for in years. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a while. Hope everything's okay. Give me a ring when you get a chance. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a reaching hand, unsure if it would be held." I didn't call back. It wasn't out of malice. It was out of preservation. Because I knew, in my marrow, that if I returned to the old rhythm, I would dissolve back into usefulness, the giver, the fixer, the forgotten, and I was done, living as a shadow in my own story. Still, I watched from a distance, as one does when the heart still holds a thread of wondering. Through neighbours, through social glimpses, through the whisper of small-town living, I began to hear what they had lost without me. The house, now legally in David's name, had begun to wear its neglect, the porch paint chipped, the garden, once my pride, had grown unruly, lavender sprouting into the walkway, roses heavy with unpruned weight. He and his wife tried to hire a landscaping service, but they didn't know the land like I did, didn't know which plant curled in shade, which needed morning light, or when to whisper gently to the soil before the frost came in. That kind of knowledge can't be outsourced, and the children, my grandchildren, began asking questions. I heard from Lucille, who runs the community craft nights, that the youngest had asked where Grandma Ellen had gone, said she missed the peach cookies, said the new lady who watched them while their parents went out smelled like plastic and didn't know any stories. I laughed quietly when I heard that, not out of cruelty, but out of the soft ache of being remembered, even in small ways. One Sunday, I passed David and his family at the farmer's market. I was browsing the honey stand. He was juggling a bag of apples, looking distracted. Our eyes met for just a second. He smiled, surprised. I nodded politely and turned back to the jars of honey. The vendor offered me a spoonful to taste, lavender-infused, soft and golden. I bought a jar and walked away with my head high and my step slow. That was the moment I felt it fully. Not revenge, not bitterness, clarity. They had expected me to be a constant, like light in a hallway, like a phone number scribbled on the fridge, always available, always on. But when I stopped showing up, things unraveled. Not catastrophically, but undeniably. Little things first. David's wife sent in a mail, the first in months, asking if I still had the recipe for Robert's stew. Said the kids had been asking for it. I read it twice, then closed the tab, not because I was punishing her, but because the recipe lived in my hands, not on paper. It was in the way I stirred at the second simmer, the way I added pepper only after the bay leaves had steeped. Some things can't be replicated without the person who carries them. A few weeks later, I heard from the lawyer, a request for a meeting from David. He had questions about the will. Of course he did. He must have found out by then that his name no longer sat where he assumed it did. That the things he expected to receive, the accounts, the Heirlooms, the security, had been redirected. I didn't respond. I let the lawyer handle it, because that was the agreement. Now I had removed myself from the emotional chain of command. No more explaining, no more defending, and when silence is mistaken for weakness, people forget its strength. I imagine he was shocked, maybe even hurt, but not because he loved me in the way he once did as a boy, but because he had planned around me, around what I would leave behind. Around the things I had carried for so long without asking for thanks. He had forgotten that a mother is not a vault, not an inheritance plan, not a backup battery for when the lights dim. I heard he started coming by the old house more often, tried fixing things, trimmed the hedges, painted the shutters. As if trying to stitch back something long since torn. But paint does not heal, and presence, when it comes too late, lands hollow. Still, I took no joy in it. I didn't watch like someone waiting for a stumble. I simply lived my days. The greenhouse flourished. I hosted women from the centre once a month for tea and handwritten poetry. I walked each morning at the lake path, humming the hymn Robert used to whistle in the garage while fixing the lawnmower, and I smiled more, not because life was perfect, but because I was no longer pretending it had to be. They lost a great many things when I let go, the meals, the memory keeper, the soft arms always open in forgiveness. But I lost something too. I lost the illusion that love must always bend, even when it breaks. And in that loss, I found a new kind of peace, not in being needed, but in no longer being used. The silence between us was now wide and firm, but I had filled my side with light. The first frost came early that year. I remember it because the tomatoes in the greenhouse froze on their stems overnight. Caught off guard by the sudden cold snap, I walked out at dawn and stood there in my robe, breath curling into the quiet, staring at the rows of fruit turned glassy and limp. I didn't cry, I didn't curse, I just stood there still, and that stillness brought something to the surface. Not rage, not grief, but a letter. One I had written 100 times in my mind but never dared to put down on paper, until then. I went back inside, boiled water, poured a cup of jasmine tea, and carried it to the desk in the front room. The morning light was soft, grey-edged, like the sky wasn't quite sure it wanted to wake up. I opened a new page in my journal, not the one where I wrote my memories. This one was separate, tucked away, meant only for truth. I dated it, folded my hands over the page, and then I began, David, I'm writing this because silence, though powerful, sometimes needs a shape. The words came slowly at first, then steadily, then all at once. I told him that I had loved him with the kind of love that lives in marrow, deep, unshakable, and painful when bruised. I wrote that I remembered everything, not the gifts or the gestures, but the moments, the way he used to crawl into bed with me after a bad dream, the way he once left a folded paper crane on my pillow the day Robert died, too young to say anything, but knowing that something had ended. I wrote about how I gave and gave, not out of obligation, but belief, that he was mine, that he would never forget where he came from, that he would always understand the language I spoke, even when it was just a bowl of soup left on the stove or the warm sweater I folded into his bag without saying a word. But I also wrote that people change, that families fracture in silence, more often than in shouts, and that I had spent too many years hoping the love I poured out would trickle back, only to realize that hope without reciprocation becomes hunger. I wrote, you didn't betray me in one blow, David. You wore me down with absence. You took what I gave freely, and then you took what I never meant to give, my home, my name on the deed, my place at the table, and when you told me not to call any more, you didn't just close the door, you locked it. You forgot I had the key, not the one to the house, the one to myself. I paused then, the tea had gone cold. My hand aches slightly, the way it does when I write long, without resting. But I wasn't finished. I continued, I have rewritten my will. You've likely discovered that by now. You may wonder why. It isn't punishment. I do not move from revenge. I move from clarity. You taught me something I never thought I'd have to learn, how to love someone enough to let go of them when they no longer see you. You thought I would always be there, you planned around that, but I am not a lighthouse built for your navigation. I am a person, a woman. And I have chosen to leave what's left of me in hands that won't close around it like a fist. I ended the letter with something simple, not a plea, not a farewell. Just, I hope, one day, you remember who I was before you decided who I should be. I signed it, not Mom, not Mother, just Ellen, because sometimes you have to reclaim your name from the mouths that misused it. I didn't send the letter. I folded it into an envelope and tucked it inside the bottom drawer of Robert's old desk, beneath the bills and spare keys. Maybe one day someone will find it. Maybe no one will. That wasn't the point. The point was I had written it. And in writing it, I gave voice to something that had lived mute inside me for far too long. The frost that killed the tomatoes also brought clarity. That morning, I stood in my garden and watched the sun finally climb over the roof of the greenhouse. The light struck the glass and splintered in every direction. Golden, unflinching, and warm. It struck me then that forgiveness is not always something you give to someone else. Sometimes it's something you allow yourself to feel, not an excuse, but to move. That letter changed me, not because of what it might do to him, but because of what it did for me. It gave shape to the silence, and it reminded me that words, once mine again, could still be holy. These days, my life is quieter than it has ever been. Not empty, not lonely. Just quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, still on the surface, but full beneath. I wake without an alarm. The light moves softly through the curtains, and the wind nudges the chimes that hang near the greenhouse door. I take my time. No rushing, no checking the phone for missed calls that no longer come, no rehearsing apologies I'll never need to speak again. I make my tea slowly, steeping it just a little longer than the box says. I've grown fond of rituals like that, things done only for myself. I sip it on the back porch wrapped in my shawl, watching the birds gather near the feeder I keep full. They arrive in flutters, little flashes of purpose, and I envy their simplicity. They take what they need and leave when they're done. No guilt, no pretending. Some days I garden, some days I just sit and watch things grow. The lavender returned stronger this season, as if it sensed my steadiness. The rosemary is stubborn as ever, but it belongs here, and so do I. There's a little boy who walks past my house most mornings with his grandmother. He must be 6, maybe 7, with a backpack too big for his shoulders and a voice like a bell. Sometimes he waves, and I wave back. Once he stopped and asked me what the smell was. I told him it was thyme, and he said, "It smells like pizza." I laughed. He wasn't wrong. I don't know his name, but I know his joy, and that's enough. Inside, the house has changed too, not in grand ways, but in small, essential ones. The photos I kept are the ones where I feel seen, not posed or placed, but real. There's one of Robert and me on a camping trip in 1985, our feet dangling in a river, his arm slung over my shoulder. Another of me and David when he was 3, both of us covered in finger paint on the kitchen floor. That one stays, because that was before forgetting began. The rooms are cleaner now, lighter. I gave away things I no longer needed. The old linen sets, the dishes no one ever came to eat from, the furniture that held too many unspoken conversations. What's left are the things that breathe with me, my books, my quilt. A jar of marbles that catch the sun just right at noon. I still journal almost every day, not out of habit, but out of reverence. I write small things, the shape of a cloud, the way the cat curled at my feet, a dream I had where Robert was building a fence, whistling the same hymn he used to hum in the garage. Sometimes I write lines to myself, like yesterday's "Peace is the sound your heart makes when you stop begging to be chosen. I no longer look for David's name on my caller ID. It's not that I don't think of him, I do, often. When I pass by the school where I once dropped him off in the rain, when I hear a song he used to hum in the back seat, when I see a man walking with a little boy and wonder if he's kind, I don't wish him harm, I don't wish him much at all. That's the thing about letting go, it's not a grand gesture. It's 1,000 small ones. It's deleting a contact without ceremony. It's walking past a toy store without thinking of birthdays. It's lighting a candle and not waiting for anyone to notice. Lucille visits sometimes. We share lemon bars on the porch and talk about the way women disappear, not all at once, but inch by inch, and how we're learning to come back, not loudly, just truthfully. Last month, the women from the literacy program came by. We sat in the garden, reading from the pages they had written themselves. First paragraphs, then poems, then whole stories stitched from memory. One woman, Clara, read about her sister who died young and how she kept her picture in a drawer for 30 years. I cried. We all did, and no one apologized. There is something holy about being known by people who have no claim on you. David hasn't reached out since the letter. I don't know if he ever found it. I suspect he did, or maybe someone told him what had changed. But I haven't heard from him, not truly, not in the way that matters. I'm not waiting. That's the difference now. The porch light is still there, but I don't leave it on for anyone else. I leave it on for me to come home to myself. Each evening, knowing I'm welcome, I do wonder, sometimes, if he ever looks at the house and feels its emptiness, if he notices that something essential left with me, not a possession, but a presence, a softness that once lived in the cushions and clung to the scent of simmering stew, a warmth that cannot be rewritten in a deed or paid for with regret, but that is his to sit with. And mine to release. The life I live now isn't filled with noise or reward or applause, but it is full, rich in quiet, steady with grace. Rooted in truths I no longer need anyone to confirm. I was the mother who gave everything. Then I was the woman who gave herself back, and in the hush that followed, I found what I'd been missing all along. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty. And that was beautiful. The last time I heard from David, it was a letter, not handwritten, not even signed with warmth. Just a typed message in a white envelope, addressed formally, Ellen Royston, no mom, no mother. I found it in my mailbox in late November, just after the first snow. The world was soft that day, white dust lining the tops of the fence, footprints from a passing dog trailing down the path. I held the letter in my hand for a long while before opening it. The paper was cold, stiff from the chill. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't remorse, it was something in between. He wrote that he had been made aware of the changes to the will, that he was surprised, disappointed, and confused. He said he had assumed I would discuss something so important with him directly. He wrote about his feelings, he wrote about intentions, he mentioned family legacy and shared understanding. But not once did he ask how I was, not once did he reference the moment he told me not to call, not once did he say he was sorry. He signed it David Royston, as if we were strangers. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me and a cup of Earl Grey steeping nearby. I let the tea go cold, as I had so many times before, lost in a kind of fog that wasn't sadness, but something quieter, resignation, maybe. Or simply the truth. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I had already said it, in silence, in boundaries, in the life I now lived. Some conversations, when delayed too long, no longer need to be had. I slipped the letter into a folder in the drawer marked unopened roads. That's where I keep things that once had a chance but never arrived. Birthday cards never sent. Recipes never shared. Photos I no longer display but don't yet have the heart to throw away. I've learned that not every door has to be opened. Some need to stay closed to protect the peace that stands on the other side. Winter settled in gently that year, the snow lingered longer on the rooftops, the world seemed quieter, as if respecting the season's stillness. I bundled myself in wool and walked daily through the garden paths, boots crunching softly beneath me. Even the greenhouse seemed to exhale more slowly, holding its warmth like a secret. Lucille stopped by one evening with cinnamon scones, fresh from the oven. We ate them beside the fire, wrapped in our blankets like two girls sharing sleepover stories. She asked if I ever missed him, not just David, but the version of him I had once known. I said yes. But I didn't say more, because grief doesn't always need to be spoken to be understood. Some nights I still think about that day on the porch, when he handed me that coffee and slipped those papers in front of me. I can remember the exact weight of the mug in my hand. The way the steam curled between us, I wonder if he remembers it too, or if, in his version of the story, I simply overreacted. But that's the thing about stories, each person writes their own. Sometimes without knowing they've become the villain in someone else's chapter. He may never understand what he did, he may never see it as betrayal. But I do, and that knowing is enough. I still think about the little boy he once was. The one who used to press flowers between books with me, who whispered dreams about becoming an astronaut, who cried into my collar the day Robert died and said, "It's just us now, right?" Yes, it was just us, until he stopped seeing me as part of us. I don't hate him for it. But I won't go back to where I was. To the woman who twisted herself into smaller and smaller shapes to remain in a room where she was only half listened to. The room is empty now, and that is better than being ignored in a crowd. In the spring, I plan to repaint the kitchen, a soft sage green, something fresh, like the smell of rain before it falls. I've thought about taking a trip too, maybe. To Maine. I've never seen the ocean on the East Coast. I want to sit beside it and let it roar without needing me to respond. I want to be a woman in a scarf, holding a book on a bench, invisible in the best kind of way. I don't need to be remembered anymore. I just need to remember myself. I've made peace with what won't be repaired. Some relationships are not mended, they're buried with love, yes, but also with acceptance. I still have the letter I wrote him. It's yellowing slightly at the edges now, like everything honest does in time. I read it once a season, just to remind myself that there is power in saying the truth, even if no one hears it but the walls. And the house, it still holds me, even if the name on the papers no longer does, because the name on the paper doesn't grow the rosemary, don't prune the rosebush. Doesn't hear the laughter of the women who come to write poems under the shade of the greenhouse window. I do, and that is my legacy. My life is mine again, small, deliberate, beautifully plain, and I no longer need a door to open to know that I'm home.